First Things, episode number 53.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Try to be perfect. We try to have everything in place at one point in time, and we can't.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and it's my goal to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. It is great to have you back with us today as we are continuing our study on essentialism. We began the study 2 weeks ago, and we are now getting into the major parts of the book. But before we do get into this, I wanted to mention something that will be more relevant if you are listening to me more in real time. If you listen to this show several months from when I record this, or even years from now, it may not mean as much to you, but yet another one of my heroes has fallen this week and has died. Many of you have heard the tragic story of what happened to Robin Williams, the comedian. And I always found Robin Williams to be quite funny and at times very inspirational in some of his movies. It was very sad to hear that he had committed suicide. Some of the reports around that he was suffering from Parkinson's disease. And to me, it's just such a great loss, and saddened for him that he got to that place in his life, saddened for his family as well. I want to play for you a small clip of about 3 minutes of one of my favorite scenes of Robin Williams in the Dead Poets Society, where he's talking to his class about the phrase carpe diem. So let's listen to this right now.
Now, Mr. Pitts. It's a rather unfortunate name. Mr. Pitts. Where are you? Mr. Pitts, will you open your hymnal to page 542? Read the first stanza of the poem you find there.
Did the virgins to make much of time?
Yes, that's the one. Somewhat appropriate, isn't it?
Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. The Latin term for that sentiment is carpe diem. Now, who knows what that means?
Carpe diem. That's to seize the day.
Very good, Mr.
Meeks.
Meeks. Another unusual name. Seize the day. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Why does the writer use these lines?
Because he's in a hurry.
No. Ding! Thank you for playing anyway. Because we are food for worms, lads. Because believe it or not, each and every one of us in this room is one day going to stop breathing, turn cold, and die. I'd like you to step forward over here and peruse some of the faces from the past. You've walked past them many times. I don't think you've really looked at them. They're not that different from you, are they? Same haircuts, full of hormones, just like you. Invincible, just like you feel. The world is their oyster. They believe they're destined for great things, just like many of you. Their eyes are full of hope, just like you. Did they wait until it was too late to make from their lives even one iota of what they were capable? Because you see, gentlemen, these boys are now fertilizing daffodils. But if you listen real close, you can hear them whisper their legacy to you. Go on, lean in. Listen. You hear it?
Carpe diem, seize the day. Our time is limited. Make every day count. And this is very much a theme in this book. We've talked about this in times past the fact that we need to seize the day. We need to embrace our now moment. There is an exercise, and we will come back to this in the book at some point, but Greg McKeown has an exercise in his book where he basically asks you to think through your life. What would you do if you only had one day to live? What would you do if you only had 1 week to live? What would you do if you only had 1 month to live? What about 2 months? What about 6 months? What about 1 year? What about 5 years? And he goes through this exercise where he really starts making you think about what's really most important to you. And are you really spending the time wisely toward the things that really resonate with you, that are passionate for you? As I've often heard Stephen Covey mention in his materials, no one on their deathbed wished that they had spent more time in the office. When people have done studies on regret with people, it is always surprising how people regret most that they didn't have the courage to live a life that was true to themselves, that they had basically lived a life that others expected of them. So many dreams that go unfulfilled because we are basically living by the expectations of others and we're not being true to ourselves. Or regretting that we worked so hard, or that we didn't have the courage to express our feelings or to stay in touch with friends and family, or to just simply allow ourselves to be happier. And it's quite sad when things like this happen to people, and it wakes us up. It pushes us to again think through our lives and ask, are we really placing our first things first? Are we really focused on the things that really matter, that really resonate to us? Or are we leaving our dreams on the floor, discarded, put on the back burner? Whatever that may be. It doesn't have to be, again, that you start your own business or do things like that, but what really matters to you? And are you pursuing those things? Fact is, if you're like me, there are so many things in life that can distract you. And if we're not careful, again, those very important but non-urgent things will be quite willing to be on the back burner, will be quite willing to be ignored. And that means that days can go by, weeks can go by, months can go by, years can go by, where our truest passions are unfulfilled, where we become distracted by lower value activities or other people's activities that may not necessarily be high values on our own agenda or our own purpose. So many things you think through in your life, like investing really quality time with your family or friends, exercising, eating healthy, being creative, reading books that really stimulate your thinking, learning, getting education, planning time wisely, taking some time off. All of these things are so incredibly important, but they're not very urgent. And therefore, we can easily put these things aside. And one of the things that I really strive to do on this show is to not let too many episodes go before we come back to that major theme. And I'm not sitting here telling you these things like I am the expert on this particular thing and I just do all of my passions and all of my dreams. I say this because it's a reminder to me to quit letting days go by that I'm not pursuing something that I'm passionate about. And again, I think it's sad that someone like Robin Williams sometimes has to die in order to wake some people up. And if you're not a fan of Robin Williams, then it didn't affect you, but eventually somebody will. And you'll look and say, wow, this was a hero of mine, or this person inspired me. And it makes you sit back and say, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? Why do I spend an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours on the internet checking email or being on Facebook when all that stuff doesn't matter? I do not want my tombstone to read, he checked email quite well, or he was on Facebook an awful lot. That's not what I want to be remembered for. And yet I find that if I'm not diligent, that's where I will spend my time. And this is the core essence of the book, Essentialism by Greg McKeown, that we have started looking at. How to live your life where you're focused on the essential things that really matter and rid yourself of the non-essential things. Now, we introduced the topic 2 weeks ago, and last week we actually heard a small talk by Greg McKeown where he kind of gives an overarching view of what essentialism is all about. Now we're going to get into the essence of essentialism. And the first chapters in this part 1 of the book, which is chapters 2, 3, and 4, basically deal with the mindset that you need to have in place if you are going to be the essentialist. So if you are going to embrace essentialism, what do you need to be thinking? And we've said this many times that our thoughts are really what trips us up so many times. If you have stinking thinking, if you have a paradigm or a worldview that defeats you all of the time, then we need to deal with that. We've got to get our thinking in order. We've got to get our thinking aligned in the right direction if we're going to be successful in really embracing essentialism. Before we actually do the things, we've got to combat our own thinking, which can really defeat us and distract us and misguide us. And the very first mindset that we're going to deal with is choice. Here's how the author starts out this section. He says, Essentialism is not a way to do one more thing. It is a different way of doing everything. It is a way of thinking. But internalizing this way of thinking is not a neutral challenge. This is because certain ideas and people peddling those ideas constantly pull us toward the logic of non-essentialism. There are 3 chapters in this part of the book. Each takes on a fallacy of non-essentialism and replaces it with a truth of essentialism. And what are those 3 fallacies that we're going to be learning over the next few weeks? The first fallacy is I have to, and I replace that with I choose to. It's a matter of choice. And we have to realign our thinking from I have to do something to I choose to do something. The second fallacy is to say that it's all important. Everything is important. And we have to learn to replace that thought with the thought that only a few things really matter. And the third fallacy is that I can do everything. And we have to replace that with a thought that I can do anything but not everything. There is a story by Neil Fiore in The Now Habit, which we have covered before in this podcast, where he talks about the power of choice. And he's talking about an example where he was a paratrooper, or he was learning to be a paratrooper, and talking about how their first training of jumping out of the plane, that some people wouldn't do that. They hesitated. They had great fear as they approached the door of the plane. They put their hands on the inside and wouldn't let go. And he remembers that some of them were actually kicked out by the sergeant, kicked out of the plane, and he could hear this terrible thud as the jumper's body would hit the side of the plane because they weren't willing to go out. And here's what he said: watching those men who showed ambivalence on leaving the plane and hearing their bodies thump against the bulkhead helped me make my first choice. I'm not leaving the plane that way, I said to myself. That's when I discovered the power of choice, a third place that is neither have to or want to. That discovery freed me to move forward to make 2 other choices. Number 1, I'm not going to get kicked out of this plane. And number 2, if I'm going to leave this plane, it will be under my own power. I'm going to maximize my chances of a safe exit. The change in my feelings at that moment was quite dramatic. Stress was replaced with purposeful action. A sense of victimhood was transformed into empowerment. And when it came my turn to approach the open door, everything about me said, I'm choosing to leave this plane. And his whole illustration there is that before this, he thought that there was only 2 options when it came to us doing things in life. Either I have to and I don't want to, or I want to. And he says he learned that there's actually a third option, and that is I choose to. That I weigh through all of the options and I choose to do something. I empower myself in the situation and realize that when it comes to me, I ultimately have that choice to decide what I'm going to do. If we constantly think inside our brains and maybe even say out loud, I have to, which basically says I have to, but I don't want to, you're going to set yourself up as a victim in this life. I have to, but if I were more powerful, I wouldn't. If I was in charge, I wouldn't. And we play that role of a victim in life, that we couldn't help ourselves, we would have done something different, but I had to because my boss told me to, or I had to because my spouse said this, or I had to because of whatever. We play the victim in that. And as we learn in the Now Habit, this can lead to a lot of procrastination in our lives. There is a famous quote that says, it is the ability to choose which makes us human. It is the ability to choose which makes us human. Or another way to say it, it is the ability to choose which makes us human. So the author of the book asks us a simple question. If you could do only one thing with your life right now, what would you do? Let me say that again, and I want you to really think about this. If you could do only one thing with your life right now, what would you do? Now, here's something we've got to realize. We need to drill this in our head. When we surrender our ability to choose, then someone else or something else is going to choose for us. We will give that control of our lives over to someone else. And the fact is, I know this takes a little bit to think through, but no one forces you to do anything, and that includes your work. If you say, well, I don't have a choice, I have to do this, that's not really honoring yourself. That's not really honoring the dignity of the choice you really have. The fact is, even if you don't make a choice, you still have made a choice. Greg McEwen says this. He says, "We often think of choice as a thing, but a choice is not a thing. Our options may be things, but a choice is an action. It is not just something we have, but something we do. This experience brought me to the liberating realization that while we may not always have control over our options, we always have control over how we choose among them. Have you ever felt stuck because you believed you did not really have a choice? Have you ever felt the stress that comes from simultaneously holding two contradictory beliefs? I can't do this, and I have to do this. Have you ever given up your power to choose bit by bit until you allowed yourself to blindly follow a path prescribed by another person? If so, you are not alone. Our ability to choose really cannot be taken away. It can't even really be given away, but it can be forgotten. There is a quote from the Lord of the Rings movie that I always really loved. It comes from the Fellowship of the Ring movie back in 2001, and they're talking about the ring, but I think it applies to our life when it comes to things like choice, where it says, "And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend, and legend became myth." And the fact is, if we don't exercise our choice, if we just lay dormant and let other people choose for us on or behalf of us, then our very choices become legends and they become myths. They become history and they can be forgotten, but they're always there. Now, the author of the book brings up an interesting example from psychology, a guy named Martin Seligman. And if that name sounds familiar, this is a psychologist who did a lot of work in something called learned helplessness. And they did some experiments, him and some other researchers, on German Shepherds. And I know that some people listening to the show may not like that people did experiments on animals, and you probably won't especially like what they did to these animals because they shocked them. And they basically put them into different situations where some dogs would have a lever that they could pull down when they were being shocked. The floor in which they were standing on would start shocking them, and they could pull the lever down to make it stop. And some other dogs could pull the lever down, but nothing would happen. Then after this went on for a little bit of time, and I know stuff like this is kind of cruel. Some of you probably don't really like this example, but it actually is historically true of what they did back then. What they did next is they took these dogs and put them into a large box with a divider, and on half of this floor, they would be shocked, and on the other half, they would be safe from being shocked. And all they had to do was just walk to the other side of the floor. Now, what they noticed is that the dogs who knew that they could push the lever down to stop the shock, they would predominantly walk to the other side and quit being shocked on the safe side of this floor. But the dogs that were in the area where the lever did nothing and they still got shocked, they had a tendency to stay on the side where they were still being shocked. They just gave in to the fact that they were going to get shocked. They didn't even try because they had learned to be helpless. They had basically given up on ever changing their situations. They basically did nothing to try to avoid getting shocked, simply because they didn't know they had any choice other than to take those shocks, because they had learned helplessness. They had learned to take the shocks, that there was nothing they could do to prevent the shocks. So when they were put into a situation where they really could have prevented being shocked, they didn't even try anymore. Now, I've seen this in my own life as a college professor. I've seen people who come into math classes and statistics classes, and they will tell me right off the bat, they'll say, "Dr. Vaughn, I just want to tell you that I'm going to be one of those students that gives you a big headache all semester because I just don't understand this stuff, and I'm going to struggle all the way through this course." And I'm thinking, goodness, they came in from the very beginning with a sense of failure, a sense of learned helplessness. They had basically already given up and said they were going to struggle the entire class. They wouldn't get it. They would probably just fail in the very end. And I'm thinking, where did they learn this? Why are they thinking this way? Why are they thinking they're automatically going to fail this class? And it had come simply from the fact that they had been exposed to failure through other math courses or things like that. They had essentially given up. They had essentially learned to be helpless. The author mentions this, and I have definitely seen this in students that I have taught. Learned helplessness basically exhibits itself in two forms, and one of them is kind of deceptive. The first one is not, and that is that people simply check out. They just quit trying. They tell people they're not going to get it, that they're going to fail. They just assume that they're never going to get it. They just quit trying. But here's another group that's very interesting who also exhibit learned helplessness. These are people that basically do the opposite. They become very hyperactive and they do everything and they take on every assignment and every opportunity and every challenge. They have to basically do everything. They do it all. So a very interesting question that you may want to ask yourself is, if you find yourself basically saying yes to everything and never saying no to things, is there any sense of learned helplessness in your life that you're trying to compensate for the feeling of helplessness, of that you can't do something by overexerting yourself and doing the opposite and becoming hyperactive and doing everything? So the stinking thinking that we have to get rid of ourselves, to purge our minds of as we are embracing essentialism, is the fact that we don't have a choice. We've got to get rid of that. We've got to get rid of these thinkings of I have to and I have no choice in the matter, to where I choose to. And yes, it's as simple as replacing your thought. The way that we deal with our thinking is not to get rid of our thoughts. It is to replace our thoughts. I don't know if you've ever tried to not think of something, but it's really impossible many, many times. I'm sure you've heard the classic example that if I told you to think of purple dancing monkeys, and then I say, don't think of purple dancing monkeys, don't think purple dancing monkeys, then the one monkey in our head becomes 2 monkeys, and they become 10 monkeys, and they become 100. The more we try not to think of it, the more it amplifies in our own minds and imaginations. The only way to really deal with thoughts are to replace thoughts with something else, because we can really only think one thought at a time. This is why we're no good at multitasking, because we're not a computer that has multiple processors that can do multiple thinking at the same time. No, we're a little bit more simpler than that. As complex as we are still simpler than a computer, and we think one thought at a time. We may switch between thoughts pretty rapidly, but we're always still going to be thinking one thing at a time. So the way we deal with our thoughts is by replacing our thoughts with something. And this isn't going to be easy. What I'm telling you right now when I say, replace your thoughts, it can kind of sound like it's simple. And if we have really strong areas in our life of stinking thinking, it isn't always going to be easy. It can be very hard to do what I'm saying we should do. And to go into your life and say, I choose to, when for maybe 10, 20, 30 years, your thinking has been dominated by I have to, that's not something that happens overnight. And I hope that you can find encouragement from that and not be discouraged. Because I think if you go into your life expecting that, I heard this on the podcast and I'm going to quit thinking this, and you expect to change 20 years of stinking thinking in one day, it just doesn't happen like that. Now, I don't think it's going to take you 20 years to undo 20 years of stinking thinking, but it's going to take some very dedicated effort. It's going to take some failures in this area, and you getting up, brushing yourself off, and saying, okay, there I went again into that stupid thought, and let me learn from this incident and learn how to say no to something. Greg McEwen says this: your choice is at the very core of what it means to be an essentialist. To become an essentialist requires a heightened awareness of your ability to choose. We need to recognize it as an invincible power within us, existing separate and distinct from any other thing, person, or force. William James once wrote, "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." That is why the first and most crucial skill you will learn on this journey is to develop your ability to choose choice in every area of your life. Let me read that last sentence again. Your most crucial skill you will learn on this journey of essentialism is to develop your ability to choose choice. We must learn to choose choice. The fact that we have a choice and we choose to exert our choice. A non-essentialist, where many of us find ourselves in life, we're dominated by the thought, I have to. We forfeit our right to choose. Where the essentialist is going to come and say, I choose to. And we are going to exercise the power of choice. Now, I have a whole podcast dedicated more to this issue of choice. And if you haven't heard it before, I would encourage you to go and listen to it. It is at firstthingsproductivity.com/21, as in episode 21. And this was part of our series on the now habit of dealing with procrastination. And the title of this episode is How to Talk to Yourself. And we go through a lot of these types of stinking thinkings of have to and how we should on ourselves. I should do this. I should be this way. And we talked a lot about the matter of choice and how we all have choice to make. And I gave an example in that whole episode, which I won't repeat verbatim here, but I was talking about running empty on my car and getting gas in my car. And just the other day, I had to stop and get gas. And notice what I even say in my words. I have to do this. And the fact is, we don't have to. We have to be willing to live with the consequences of our choices. So when I'm sitting there saying, I have to stop and get gas, I stop myself. I stop my thinking and say, wait a minute, Brandon, I don't have to stop and get gas. I could just keep going home. But let's now weigh the consequences of the different choices. If I choose to go home, there's a chance I may run out of gas, and that means I'm going to have to find somebody to take me to a gas station or get towed or something like that. Do I want that? And versus the choice that I can go ahead and stop and get gas now and avoid that, but have to deal with the consequences of the inconvenience of having to stop. The fact is, I do have a choice, but I've trained myself to think I don't have a choice. I have to stop and get gas. Well, no, I don't have to. I choose to because I've weighed through the different consequences of all of the choices and decided this is the better choice. Anyway, I would encourage you to go back and listen to episode 21, How to Talk to Yourself, if you want to get a little bit more information about the issue of choice. Because the fact is, when we forget that we have the ability to choose, when we let the stinking thinking that you have to's or you should do something instead of I choose to, then we learn to be helpless in life. We learn to take on the role of a victim in our life. And we cannot have that if we're going to be focused on essentialism. Essentialism means that we cannot play the victim in life anymore. We must replace our stinking thoughts of non-choice victim of have-tos and shoulds with empowerment thoughts that I choose to do things in life. I am not going to live by other people's choices or my own past choices. I am going to embrace the now moment and my choice in the now moment. Because again, remember, if we do not choose, if we surrender our right to choose, we are not just giving other people that power. We are giving them a very explicit permission to choose for us. And so this is our first pillar. We've got 3 pillars of thinking that we must have in place to embrace essentialism. That very first pillar is the pillar of choice. We have the right to choose. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode on the pillar of choice in essentialism, the first mindset that we must have in place in order to see essentialism thrive in our lives. As always, please consider leaving me a rating and a comment on iTunes. And I've had some great comments from people in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and Australia. Thank you so much for all the comments you have left me in this show. But anyone else, anywhere else in the world, if you're not in the United States, in the United Kingdom, or in Australia, and you're listening to me, especially through iTunes, I would love to get some feedback from you if you would consider doing that. Would love to have other people in your particular area of the world or your country know about the show and trust some of your words of wisdom about if you gain any benefit from the show. You can leave me comments on this particular episode at firstthingsproductivity.com/53 as in episode 53. You can also leave me a voicemail there, and you can also reach me through Twitter and Facebook as well. And eventually, I know I keep saying this, I will remember at some point during my week to finish setting up my email so that you can communicate with me through email, because I think many of you would probably prefer to communicate with me that way. And I know it's such a simple thing, but there's so many things that come up during the week, and it just kind of always slips my mind. But hopefully I'll have that in place very soon. So until next time, remember this. It is the ability to choose which makes us human. Do not give other people the right to choose for you. Live up to your worth and your dignity as the only you that is on this planet, because there is no other you like you. And therefore, you owe it not only to yourself, but to this world to choose. And as we learn today, start replacing some of your stinking thinking of have-tos and shoulds with I choose to, and embrace that empowering position of the uniqueness of who you are in this life. Embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.